First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here, full of a room, in a room, full of people who are dedicated to the field of remote viewing. I see a number of friends, and I hope to have some time with all of you during this program. Unfortunately, I have another business. I live here in Las Vegas, and our other business is hosting an event this weekend, so I won't be around as much as I'd like to be. But I know what dedication is here in the room. And I suppose because of all of that dedication, the topic of my presentation might sound a little provocative. And it is meant to. I intended to provoke you a little bit. And really, to be honest, I should say maybe remote viewing is not viewing. There are some other perspectives that merit our consideration. Should I be moving to get away from that feedback? You can. Yeah, because it annoys me. It's hard for me to talk when that ringing occurs.
That's a good place.
Okay. What I really want to talk about are models, theoretical ways of thinking of remote viewing. And basically, the viewing model has been the dominant model in parapsychology ever since the 1930s when J.B. Rhine began to popularize the term extrasensory perception. We talk about it as a sixth sense. We talk about it as if it's just an extension of our regular nervous system. Sometimes we use the term mental radio to imply that remote viewing is somehow analogous to radio or television. And the purpose of my talk is to suggest that there are some very, very different ways of thinking about this. And I actually lean very strongly. It's not as if you can discount the viewing metaphor. It's a very powerful metaphor, and the word has stuck, and I think we're all happy with it, but, and there are some big buts. If I could have the next slide. Viewing is the term that I'm going to use as a sort of shorthand for what John Palmer in his 1979 address to the Parapsychological Association called the information transmission model or paradigm for ESP. And it basically suggests that you've got A, your target, and B, your perceiver, and that information is transmitted from A to B, and it's received at that end. Now, let me just say at the outset, I think it's interesting that I'm referring back to a seminal address given by John Palmer at the 1979 Parapsychological Association meeting. That was 27 years ago. And in reflecting upon it, it dawned on me how slow progress in this field is. There aren't that many scientific associations that would keep referring back to papers given that long ago, but my sense is that we haven't yet digested the impact of what John Palmer was trying to say. William James once said of this field that it's not like other disciplines where you can measure progress decade by decade by decade. In the field of parapsychology, or what he then called psychical research, he said we have to measure progress by the half century and by the century. Now that's somewhat problematic for any field of science, and it's problematic for my talk in particular because one of the arguments that I want to make is that this extrasensory, or this information transmission, this viewing model, if it were a really good scientific model, I think we would be making progress faster than we are. Why is progress so slow in this field? I think that in itself says something about the nature of the phenomenon with which we're working. Now, the viewing paradigm has with it a number of other concepts with which we're all familiar. They're part of the folklore, part of the language people who learn remote viewing use. For example, analytical overlay. That implies that there's a signal coming through. It gets misinterpreted by the logical, analytical part of the brain, and so when a viewer is describing their mental imagery and they describe some image and it's not correct, we use this term. Again, it comes out of the information transmission model. Signal-to-noise ratio, right out of information transmission theory. If we can just do something to enhance that ratio, maybe by quieting the mind, the signal will come through more clearly. The majority vote method is also something that comes out of the signal or the information transmission model, that if you have a number of different weak signals coming through and they're independent of each other, and then you take a vote of those different weak signals, that should amplify the signal itself. These are concepts that have all been used in remote viewing, and they come out of thinking about it as if it were information transmission. Associative remote viewing is based on the idea that pictures, objects, are easier to view than numbers, that there's something about numbers that are harder. So if you want to do financial forecasting, looking at what the stock market is going to do, the thinking behind associative remote viewing is that it's easier to associate fluctuations in the stock market or the commodities market with different pictures, rather than asking a viewer simply to tell you what tomorrow's number is going to be, or even what tomorrow's direction in the market is going to be. And then there's this interesting work done by Ed May about the gradient of entropy of remote viewing targets, and it comes right out of the field of visual perception. The gradient of entropy has to do with the way some aspects of the target will stand out, like if you're a lion waiting for your prey in the grasses of the African savanna. The gradient of entropy is a technical term which would describe how the perceptual system of the lion works to identify prey, like an antelope walking through the grass. And Ed May did some very pioneering research with remote viewing targets in which he seemed to find that the same held true, that remote viewing targets with a very high gradient of entropy were better targets. Again, that kind of thinking comes out of the information transmission model. And of course, we have a classic study by James Spottiswoode in which he showed that over a period of many years, remote viewing abilities seem to spike very significantly at 13 and a half hours local sidereal time. It is not that Spottiswoode ever had an information transmission theory necessarily, but the implication for this has always been for me that it is an information transmission model, and that normally there are, you could say, cosmic radiations, noise in the cosmos that interferes with remote viewing. But at 1330 hours is a time when wherever you are on the planet, you're at the opposite side of the Earth from where the galactic center of the Milky Way would be located, and therefore you're shielded from certain radiations coming from the center of the galaxy, where astronomers now tell us there's a black hole and all sorts of interesting radiations like positrons, particles moving even backwards through time, coming out of the galactic center. And if we can be shielded from them, maybe that would reduce the signal-to-noise problem and enhance remote viewing. So all of these things lend a certain amount of credence to the information transmission model. And my best guess is that, I could be wrong, but my best guess is that most of us in the room here sort of take that model for granted without really thinking about it too much. It seems like a good model for remote viewing. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, the term remote viewing, which was developed in the 1970s, came about at the same time that the military intelligence establishment was putting a lot of money into a program called remote sensing. In other words, satellite photography, which has made enormous progress since the 1970s. Next slide. Now, there are some things to be said for the strength of the remote viewing paradigm. And several people here in this room are, I would say, exemplars for how well that paradigm can work. For example, Russell Targ, who has, as I recall, an 85% success rate as an experimenter in published studies of remote viewing. That suggests that, that we've got a very good working practical model. Or Stephen Schwartz, who introduced me, who has done a number of successful archaeological applications using remote viewing. Hard to argue with that kind of success. Or another example would be Joe McMoneagle, and probably others of you here in the room who from time to time come up with descriptions and drawings of targets that are virtually 100% accurate. Now, how can you get that kind of accuracy if the information transmission model isn't working, isn't applicable in this case? So if I'm going to present an alternative to you to the information transmission model, at least that alternative has to also be capable of explaining these kinds of successes. And given these successes, you might be asking right now yourself, why have an alternative at all? What's wrong with the information transmission model? Why not think of remote viewing as just another form of viewing? And my reason is, very simply, all right, go ahead. Let me, I'm getting my slides a little bit out of order, but let's talk in more depth about the implications of the remote viewing model, and the reasons why it breaks down will begin to become clear. The first thing the model requires is that you have a target, and information about the target. That's where it starts. Then that information has to be transmitted somehow. There has to be a medium of transmission. But I highlighted that in red because after all of these years, we don't have a medium of transmission. Researchers back in the 1970s began to think, well, maybe this is electromagnetic somehow, but it became quite clear when you have precognitive remote viewing and you have remote viewing over great distances, thousands of miles from one side of the planet to the other with apparently no diminution of accuracy, that the electromagnetic mode of transmission breaks down. There's no known mode of transmission that can account for the information received through remote viewing. Then there's coding. How do you code that information? We have no concept of how it would be coded. The reception of the transmission requires some kind of an organ of reception, but we have yet to discover any kind of an organ of reception, a sixth sense organ in the human body. We have no concept of that. We don't have a clue. At best, people say, well, it's your whole mind, your whole brain somehow. But if we look at the neurons, the synapses, the structure of the brain, there's nothing there that we have yet to identify after decades of research that would seem to be an organ of perception for remote viewing. And then the decoding of the information has to be coded and decoded. And we know quite a bit about how auditory information and visual information is coded and decoded. But again, we haven't the least bit of information as to how remote viewing would work in that regard. So there's some huge gaps in our understanding of how the information transmission model would apply to remote viewing. We do know that somehow information about the target is displayed in the mind, or what you could think of as the sensorium of remote viewers. We know that remote viewers are able to report that information. And we know that through the process of judging, the reports of remote viewers are evaluated. But as you can see, the information transmission model as it pertains to remote viewing has some serious gaps in it. Now, the main problem as I see it with the information transmission model is, very simply, after 30 years, we have yet to attain consistent applications in financial forecasting, in espionage, in crime investigation, and in medical diagnosis. And it seems to me, if the information transmission model really were suitable, we would have made more progress by now. And I don't mean to denigrate the progress that we have made. I know a lot of you here in the room have important success stories. Still, I think we have to acknowledge that while remote viewing almost broke into the mainstream as a result of the Stargate program in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, it's no longer even close to that. One would expect if there were a substantial theoretical body of information, we would have seen more progress. Now, I realize I said earlier the whole field of parapsychology and psychical research moves much more slowly than that, but we have to ask ourselves why. I can say this, in the 1970s, in 1973, when I first learned about remote viewing and all the successes that were being attained at the Stanford Research Institute, I imagined that this was going to be revolutionary. This was going to change our whole culture, and it was going to happen quickly. And I know, today we can look back and there are 20 or 30 good books and thousands of people doing remote viewing, but I have to say, honestly, it's still on the very fringes of our culture. It hasn't lived up to my expectations. And as I look back, I think maybe there are some theoretical reasons why this is the case. It may be that the whole viewing model, the information transmission model, is seriously incomplete, and that we need to begin to rethink deeply what remote viewing is all about. There are a number of alternatives to the information transmission model that have been proposed along the years. The first of these was really articulated by the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung going back into the 1930s, and he wrote an essay called The Soul and Death. It's a very profound essay in which Carl Jung began to look at the nature of the human psyche. Psyche is the Greek word for soul. And he began to think that the psyche itself is not at all what modern science thinks about the human mind. It was out of this kind of thinking that he later developed his theory of synchronicity. And I'll come back to this and go into it in more depth. Another interesting alternative approach I'm borrowing from the field of literature. The Nobel laureate writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote a short story in 1949, revised in 1972, called The Aleph. and he draws upon ancient Kabbalistic thinking regarding the nature of time and space. I'm going to come back to that. Then, I've already referred to John Palmer's seminal presidential address to the Parapsychological Association in 1979, in which he articulated an alternative to the information transmission model for all of parapsychology, and he called it the conformance behavior model. And I want to say a little bit about that, and more recently, Larry Dossey, in his interpretations of the research in psychic healing and psychic medical diagnosis, I think around 1989, came up with a concept called non-local mind. Now, non-local mind is a very different way of looking at things than information transmission or viewing. And I also want to talk about an important approach to parapsychology developed by George Hansen, published in his book in 2001, The Trickster and the Paranormal. It also suggests that we have to think very differently about the phenomenon with which we're dealing. Now let me start out with Carl Jung's book on, or his essay on death and immortality. It's published in this anthology, and Jung basically suggested that the human psyche is immortal, that we survive death, and that every night when we dream, we're being prepared in some way for the after-death state, that it's very similar to the dream state. And I'd like to quote to you for a minute what Jung said about the nature of the psyche in that essay going back to the 1930s. Oh, okay, go ahead. I also want to refer, while I'm at it, to Jung's essay on synchronicity, published actually in 1964, but the book dates back to 64, but Jung was writing about this in the 50s and even earlier, because synchronicity is a very important concept in looking at alternatives to the information transmission model, and it grows out of Jung's view of the psyche. Now I'm going to read to you what Carl Jung wrote in 1934. The limitation of consciousness in space and time is such an overwhelming reality that every occasion when this fundamental truth is broken must rank as an event of the highest theoretical significance. For it would prove that the space-time barrier can be annulled. The annulling factor would then be the psyche, since space-time would attach to it at most as a relative and conditioned quality. Under certain conditions, the psyche could even break through the barriers of space and time precisely because of a quality essential to it, that is, its relatively transspatial and transtemporal nature. This possible transcendence of space-time, for which it seems to me there is a good deal of evidence, is of such incalculable import that it should spur the spirit of research to the greatest effort. Well, that was written well over 70 years ago, and while there's been a lot of research, I would say it hasn't been spurred to the greatest effort. We have a long way to go. But what Jung is saying here, he's not talking about information transmission. He's essentially saying that what we think of as space and time are conditioned. It's a way that our minds have been conditioned to think, but that the conditioning doesn't always work, that the mind itself transcends space and time. Now, John Palmer tried to formalize this sort of thinking a little more when he came up with his idea of conformance behavior. And you'll remember earlier I showed you a very simple diagram that epitomized the information transmission or viewing model, where you have information going from the target to the viewer. In the conformance behavior, you have the target and you have the viewer, A and B, but it's not as if information is going from A to B. Instead, you have something more like this, a resonance. There is a C factor in there, some deep structure of reality. And it causes a resonance, a synchronistic resonance to occur between the target and the viewer. It's not at all like information being transmitted from one to the other. And Palmer was deliberately vague as to how this could occur. He admitted, we don't know any more about this mechanism than we would about an information transmission mechanism, but maybe if we begin to think about it in different ways, we'll come up with some interesting testable hypotheses. We might be able to make some progress. And looking back now, 27 years, I can say that very few people in the field of parapsychology took up Palmer's challenge. Still, I think it's important, and I'll explain why, to begin to think more and more along these lines. Larry Dossey introduced the concept of non-local mind. And he introduced it based on certain concepts in physics. How many of you have heard the concept of non-local mind? Would you raise your hands? Most of you have. How many of you understand what it means? Fewer. I'm going to try. How many of you understand what non-locality is? Good. For those of you who don't, I'm going to try and explain it as best I can, a little bit more. Again, we have your target A, we have your viewer B, we have this mediating factor C, and then we have non-local mind encompassing all of those things. In other words, mind is everywhere. Mind itself, consciousness itself, psyche itself, you could even say spirit. Some people might say the mind of God. Encompasses all of this. It sounds like a very mystical, spiritual idea, but it's derived from thinking in theoretical physics. The idea of non-locality, I don't know how clear this diagram is to you. What you're looking at on the screen is a light cone. And this is an illustration from the 1975 edition of my book, The Roots of Consciousness. Can you see the writing? Not too well. Well, there's a line right across the center. And that line, do you see that in the middle? And there's a cone above it and a cone below it. Can you see that? Okay. There's an arrow, a vertical arrow. The vertical dimension represents time. The horizontal dimension represents space. The line right across the middle represents the present moment. And what it suggests is that our ability to perceive the future is limited according to the speed of light. And that's what that cone represents. We can only see into the future as far as light can reach us at the speed of light. So the further you go into the future, the larger the cone is, because light will be able to travel further according to the speed of light the more time it has. Similarly, in the past, if I want to see something in the present instant, like the 1/1,000,000th of a second or so, or a trillionth of a second, I can only perceive as much as light can travel in that amount of time. Now, outside of the light cone, past and future, it's called the absolute elsewhere. If information can reach me from outside of the light cone, it's traveling, in effect, faster than the speed of light, or it's traveling by some modality that's different than the speed of light. I mean, for example, the star Alpha Centauri is 4 light years away from Earth. That would mean that information reaching me, light that comes to a telescope from Alpha Centauri, is in effect 4 years old. Anything we see when we look at Alpha Centauri happened 4 years ago. If something happens at this instant in time on Alpha Centauri and I'm aware of it, I learned about it through some type of non-local perception, faster than light, outside of the light cone, coming to me from the absolute elsewhere. Now here you have 2 different light cones, like somebody on Alpha Centauri and me. We each have our own separate light cones. We're separated by enough distance that light cannot reach between us instantly, but if we're able to communicate, and you see those arrows, in 1976, when Jack Sarfati created this, physicist Jack Sarfati, for the Roots of Consciousness, he called it quantum information transfer. Now we think of it as non-locality, information going faster than the light cone. And there have been experiments in physics where this has been measured and this occurs. There are correlations that occur that cannot be explained as occurring within the light cone. They're outside of the light cone. Quantum dematerialization and materialization. If somebody dematerialized on Alpha Centauri and materialized here instantly, not 4 years later, that would be an example of a quantum information transfer. But you see, he's already using the information transfer metaphor, and we now know that's not true. We now know very clearly you cannot send a signal using this mechanism. Correlations occur, statistically significant correlations occur, but not information transmission with this kind of non-local interaction. And I begin to think that approximates what we experience with remote viewing. Now let me say, jumping forward yet again to George Hansen's book, The Trickster and the Paranormal. How many of you are familiar with this book? It's a rather obscure book in the field of parapsychology. It is very erudite. He draws quite heavily on a lot of thinking and sociology, deconstruction, hermeneutic analysis. But his bottom line is very simple, and I think it's very important for us to pay attention to. He's referring to psi, but we could call it remote viewing. He says it's fundamentally linked to destructuring, to change, to transition, to disorder, to marginality, to the ephemeral, fluidity, ambiguity, and the blurring of boundaries. In other words, you could say this about remote viewing and psychic phenomenon in general: it's too real for any of us in the room, certainly, to ignore, but it's not real enough to be embraced by the mainstream of our culture. And according to George Hansen, that's a fundamental truth about this phenomenon, and it always will be and always has been over the long run. I mean, there are times in history, I think you can look back and see when the various magi or prophets or people, Sufis, people who had these powers did achieve a kind of central role in their own culture, but usually that was pretty unstable and didn't last. And in the next generation, those same people would be beheaded or something to that effect. It's another way of looking at this phenomenon that it may relate to the conformance model, it may not, but he's suggesting that there will always be this fuzzy factor that will keep the information transmission model from fully succeeding, from fully accomplishing its potential. That there's something intrinsic to the nature of the phenomenon that we're looking at that is always going to result in this kind of social marginalization. And it's a 500-page book. He goes into many reasons why he believes it's true. And I think it's one of those books that, as a parapsychologist, I'd rather not have to deal with, but I think it's important that we try and absorb what George Hansen has to say in this regard. Finally, I want to refer to the book, The Seat of the Soul, written by a friend and colleague of mine, Gary Zukoff. How many of you are familiar with this book? Many of you. It's been a bestseller. And I, at one time, had a conversation with Gary, and I asked him, well, what about using remote viewing, using intuition for practical applications? That's been a lifelong passion of mine. And his answer was very provoking. He said this. He said, if you're going to use intuition for some practical application, the result that you get will be based on the needs of your soul. It will be based, in effect, on your karma, what you need the most for your own soul's growth. He said, you might, for example, attempt to use remote viewing for financial forecasting, but what if really the best thing that could happen to your soul would be if you went bankrupt? He said, that's what you're going to get. So he's raising now a whole other question about what that C is in the middle when I refer to conformance behavior. What are some of the principles that we need to begin to take into account? And he's referring to what metaphysical thinkers call karma. It's not a term that ever appears in the parapsychology literature, but maybe it's one that we need to consider. Now, another term developed by Carl Jung is the collective unconscious. And when I think of that big C, I think it might stand for collective unconscious. And if we look at the collective unconscious, a Jungian term, which refers to it's never clear whether he means it metaphorically or sociologically, or if he means it literally as some kind of a consciousness that connects human beings with their environment. I think he actually did mean it in a literal sense, but because of reasons of propriety and social respect, he kind of glosses over that to some degree. If we think about C as the collective unconscious, then if we consider, well, what are the factors that are going to lead to this resonance rather than information transmission that results in a successful remote viewing hit, we might begin to look at some of these factors. Psychic complexes. And in the Sanskrit, there's the term samskara, which is an interesting term. It refers to kind of the mental habits that we all have that have been formed and that, you know, our minds work habitually most of the time. When I get into my car and drive across Las Vegas to come here to this resort for our meeting, I'm hardly thinking about my driving because it's been so deeply ingrained in me. I can listen to the radio or talk on my cell phone, and somehow, at not even a fully conscious level, I steer the car and park it and arrive here. And we all operate this way. I'm going to guess that, conservatively speaking, 50% of the time we're operating out of habit. It's probably really closer to 90% of the time, maybe 99% of the time. Archetypes. Now, archetypes go a little bit beyond our own personal conditioning. Archetypes are the denizens of the collective unconscious. They represent, you might say, the great mythological figures that influence humanity. They're thought in a Jungian sense to have an autonomous existence of their own. And they have a way of sweeping people, masses of people, under their influence. And I'll give you one example. In 1939, Carl Jung began reporting in the dreams of his German, Austrian, and Swiss patients archetypal images associated with what he thought was the German Teutonic, ancient Teutonic god Wotan, the god of war. And he wrote an essay saying that he believed there was going to be another major war in Europe because he could see the images of the archetype Wotan arising in the consciousness of people. And one wonders, looking back at the last 5 years of what I think of as a dark age in our own country, how easily this country went to war. How there seemed to be token opposition in Congress, in the press. Although I know many people were out protesting, and I know some of you here think the war was a good thing, one wonders in retrospect how rapidly it happened. Could the country have gotten caught up in some sort of an archetypal energy? Does that happen at times and results in mass movements, things about which individuals are barely conscious? Good examples of this can be found in Jean Shinoda Boland's books, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman, about how these archetypal energies can take over people's lives, and we sometimes don't even realize it's happening to us when it happens. But also it can be conscious. Karma. I referred to karma when I used the example of Gary Zukav. And I'm going to come back to karma now because you may remember earlier I gave you 3 outstanding examples, and I know there are more here in this room, of people who are very successful as remote viewers. Russell Targs, Stephen Schwartz in his work in psychic archaeology, Joe McMoneagle in his work. And I'm just wondering if those particular individuals are so successful because they were particularly suited karmically. There's no way that I can think of now to prove or disprove that idea. But when you look at those outstanding successes and you compare them to the larger database of work in remote viewing, it suggests to me that there might be something going on of a karmic nature that leads some people to be more successful than others in this field. And it might be something that eventually we can get a handle on. I think we have a long way to go, but it's worth discussing. I think, the question of karma is one that you hear it all the time in New Age culture, maybe to the point of nausea, but it may be something that people serious about parapsychology and remote viewing could pay attention to. Along with karma is the idea of spiritual evolution. I think they're related. Now, I mentioned earlier, as an alternative way of thinking about remote viewing, the concept of the Aleph, which was really developed in the field of literature in a magnificent short story written by the Nobel laureate Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer. And he defines in his story the Aleph, and there's a picture of the Penguin paperback. He says, yes, the Aleph is the only place on earth where all places are seen from every angle, each standing clear, without any confusion or blending. The Aleph it's a Kabbalistic symbol. It's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's a silent letter. It's a letter that stands for the silent presence of the divine, actually. And it is related to the concept of space, the concept of time, that when one for one reason or another, makes contact with the Aleph, then one can experience what in other contexts would be called cosmic consciousness, being totally aware of everything simultaneously, but not in a way where it all gets mushed and blended together, but where everything still is distinct and can be seen simultaneously from multiple angles. Doesn't that somehow resonate with what we know of as remote viewing? Let me tell you a little bit more about what Borges has written about the Aleph. I'm going to quote from this story. And here in the story, Borges uses himself as the main character. The character is called Borges. And let me just say a little bit to set the stage. This is a classic story. It's, I think, one of the greatest pieces of, probably in my mind, the best short story ever written in the 20th century. Borges has fallen in love with a woman, Beatrice, who dies. And she never really returned his love, but he has almost developed a cult around her, because now that she's dead, he can worship her without being afraid that she's going to scorn him. And every year he visits her house, where her cousin also lives. And over many years, because he and the cousin really hate each other, they get to know each other. The cousin is also a writer. And finally, the cousin confides in him. The cousin has written this epic poem, which is going to describe every place on earth. And the house is about to be torn down, and the cousin finally confides to Borges that the reason he was able to write this epic poem is because in the basement of the house is the mythical Aleph. And Borges at this point is thinking, this man is off of his rocker. He's a nutcase, but I'll play along with him. And he says, okay, I'd like to see the Aleph if it's really in your basement. So the cousin allows Borges to enter into the basement of this house. And now Borges is alone, lying in the basement, and he thinks, oh my gosh, this cousin, he's going to use this as an occasion to kill me or something. And then, all of a sudden, he sees the Aleph. He says, in that single gigantic instant, I saw millions of acts, both delightful and awful. Not one of them amazed me more than the fact that all of them occupied the same point in space without overlapping or transparency. What my eyes beheld was simultaneous, but what I shall now write down will be successive because language is successive. Under the step toward the right, I saw a small incandescent sphere of almost unbearable brightness. At first I thought it was spinning. Then I realized that the movement was an illusion produced by the dizzying spectacles inside it. The Aleph was probably 2 or 3 centimeters in diameter, but universal space was contained within it, with no diminution in size. Each thing, the glass surface of a mirror, let us say, was infinite things, because I could see clearly from every point in the cosmos. I saw the populous sea, saw dawn and dusk, saw the multitudes of the Americas, saw a silvery spider web at the center of a black pyramid, saw a broken labyrinth, it was London, saw endless eyes, all very close, studying themselves in me as though in a mirror, saw all the mirrors on the planet, and none of them reflecting me. Saw in a rear courtyard on Calle Soler the same tiles I'd seen 20 years before in the entryway of a house on Fray Bentos. Saw clusters of grapes, snow, tobacco, veins of metal, water vapor. Saw convex equatorial deserts and their every grain of sand. I saw in the drawer of a writing table, and the handwriting made me tremble, unbelievable, obscene, detailed letters which Beatrice had written to Carlos Argentino, her cousin. I saw the rotted dust and bones that had once deliciously been Beatrice Viterbo. I saw the circulation of my own dark blood. I saw the coupling of love and the modification of death. I saw the Aleph from every point and angle. And in the Aleph I saw the earth, and in the earth the Aleph, and in the Aleph the earth. I saw my own face and my own bowels. I saw your face, and I felt dizzy and wept, for my eyes had seen that secret and conjectured object whose name is common to all men, but which no man has looked upon, the unimaginable universe. So there's something already that's happened here. The woman he loved, he now has discovered, has been having an affair with her own cousin who he hated, who had shown him the Aleph. And as the story ends, Borges, who has had this awesome experience, now comes out of the cellar. And the cousin, Carlos Argentino, says to him, "Well, did you see the Aleph?" And Borges says to him, "No, I didn't see anything at all. You might as well let them tear the house down." It's an example of how, for psychological reasons, for emotional reasons, we sometimes don't live up to the potential that's represented by the Aleph. And it gets at some of the psychological issues that can interfere with that, I'm going to use the term resonance, that represents remote viewing at its best. And it reminds me a little bit of an occasion I had when Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, spoke at Berkeley when I was a student back in 1973. And you know, he's written some wonderful books that describe the functioning of telepathy, like Childhood's End. At the same time, he had just been quoted in Time magazine as poo-pooing parapsychology, and particularly the phenomenon reported by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff regarding Uri Geller. So after his talk, I raised my hand and I said, "Mr. Clarke, do you believe in ESP?" And his answer, I think, was extremely revealing. He said to me, "No, I do not, because I don't want anybody to read my mind." Next slide. Now, I used the term spiritual evolution a little earlier as something that we need to think about here. And one of the best models of which I am aware with regard to spiritual evolution is the theories of Arthur M. Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, the author of books like The Reflexive Universe, The Bell Notes, The Geometry of Meaning. Arthur has developed a diagram that's shown here. You probably can't see it all. It's called his arc. And what he's suggesting is at the level of pure spirit in the physical universe, it manifests itself with what scientists and philosophers of science call the quantum of action. And you can sometimes think of that also as the photon. You know, photons are mysterious things. Ken Wilber, of course, made fun of Arthur Young's thinking because he said, how can anybody believe that you can take consciousness and say it resides in or is based on the photon? The photon is just another particle. But it isn't. But is it? You know, Einstein developed his theory of relativity by imagining what it would be like to ride on a photon as it's traveling across the universe at the speed of light. And one of the things that Einstein deduced by visualizing this was that if you were riding on a photon and you had a watch, the watch would stop. There would be no time whatsoever. And this has now been confirmed in experiments in physics. The implications of this are very profound because when I showed you the light cone before, and we talked about the speed of light traveling at 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light is always relative to somebody like one of us here on Earth as light goes whizzing by to or from another planet. So light would take 4 years on my watch to travel from Alpha Centauri to the Earth. But if I were riding on a photon, it would take no time at all. That's why, in some sense, physicists say, well, it's not as if there are photon particles exactly, because we know it's a particle wave paradox, but you could say there's one photon and it's everywhere at once, in all time, in all space. And there are some other very interesting properties of light that have led Arthur Young to equate it with spirit. But what he's suggesting, and you can find this in the classic myths of almost every culture, that the whole process of existence involves what you can think of as the descent of spirit into matter, and then the ascent of matter back to spirit. And Arthur Young looks at this step by step throughout all the kingdoms, and he says it starts with the photon, you get other subatomic particles, eventually you get atoms, and you get molecules. And when you reach the level of molecules, spirit is fully embedded in matter. And then it begins to return back, and the molecules become like living molecules, like viruses and various molecules associated with RNA and DNA. You get the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. In humans, through our consciousness, we're aspiring in some way to reincorporate the sense of pure spirit, pure freedom of spirit that we experienced at the very beginning of evolution, going back to the beginning of the universe. And Arthur Young would say that if we were to break this down in stages, we humans have a long way to go. We may be as evolved in our spiritual evolution as we are in terms of what he would think of as being fully human, as, let's say, clams are evolved in relationship to the whole animal kingdom. So I bring this up as a way of suggesting that one of the impediments towards the full development of remote viewing is simply the human condition itself. How evolved we are as human beings along our larger path of spiritual evolution. I'm just trying to place it into a larger context. And I'll close my talk with that thought, and since we have some time, I'll be happy to entertain some questions. Yes?
One theory you didn't mention was the holographic nature, possibly, of the universe. A couple of theorists have talked about that, and that would mean that every particle and every person really contains the essence of the whole of the universe, in which case we really have all the information we need in each of us. It's simply a matter of accessing that. It's kind of far out, but
Did everybody hear him? No. What he suggested is that I forgot one other model, the holographic nature of the universe, which the idea of the hologram is that every piece of the hologram contains the information of the whole hologram. So once again, it's not an information transmission way of looking at it. It's not as if you see the target. It's more like you are the target. Yeah. So that would be another approach consistent with the conformance behavior, the resonance idea of John Palmer. Yes?
Isn't that hologram similar to your left, the seeing all and not everything in it? Why wouldn't it be a holographic experience?
I couldn't hear you.
I'm saying, why wouldn't the left be a holographic experience? It contains all.
The Aleph.
Yeah.
Yes, the Aleph is exactly a metaphor for the holographic experience. I would agree with you. Mm-hmm.
well, let me do another one.
Okay.
Nobody else. You were talking about, let me just stand up, maybe that'd be easier.
And why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Steve Hall, and I'm from Central Florida. You mentioned earlier about the percentage of accuracy regarding remote viewing, and I'm a little astonished by that because you mentioned, for example, 100% of Joe McMonagle, and I don't think even he would claim that. And there's one thing I think we need to do, and that is be careful not to exaggerate claims that and maybe you meant something different.
Let me be specific about what I meant. He's raising the question of why did I say that Joe McMonagle on occasion has been 100% accurate, or other people have, and that's what I meant, on occasion. I have seen remote viewings, I think in my lifetime, 2 or 3 or 4 instances of remote viewings when every statement made by the viewer was accurate. So that's what I meant. Not that it happens 100% of the time that way. It happens a tiny fraction of the time. But often when you do see that, it makes you think, gee, this is like a perfect information transmission. It seems like it. How could such detail and accuracy occur if it wasn't information being transmitted? And how many of you have ever experienced, why don't we get a show of hands, 100% accuracy in a remote viewing? Quite a few of you. Yes, okay. Question?
So it seems that something is missing. Like, what accounts for the reproducibility, or what accounts for people being better than other people who have no ability? Like, what's the missing factor?
Well, the question is, why are some people better? If we use an information transmission model, we might come up with one set of reasons. Like, some people can quiet their minds more. Some people have a better organ of reception, whatever that is. If we think of it in terms of some of the models that I've been using, it might have more to do with questions of spiritual evolution or karma. Yes?
Who's working to alter or change the current model so that it can evolve? Because you said that the model is not complete.
So the question is, who is working on the changing of the model?
Yeah, how do you...
Well, it's a social process. It involves people, like many people here in the room, who are writing and publishing in the field of remote viewing and thinking about it. Any number of people here in this room are contributing to that effort.
Couldn't that be better organized?
The question is, couldn't that be better organized? I don't know.
Have you seen this convention?
Yeah, it is what it is. Yes?
Do you know if there is any correlation between the transmission of information through remote viewing and the changing electromagnetic field of the planet and the gradually changing density of matter?
The question is, are there any known correlations between the transmission of information in remote viewing, the changing electromagnetic field on the planet, and the changing density of matter? Number one, there have been studies correlating remote viewing and ESP with geomagnetic fluctuations. I think those studies are iffy. I know James Spottiswoode is one of the leading researchers in that area, and to the best of my knowledge, he is questioning the validity of his own findings in that regard. As far as the changing density of matter is concerned, I don't have any information on that. I've never heard that phrase before. Yes?
Could you liken remote viewing to like a divine kenosis? If you look at the times past, like the prophets past, from a spiritual perspective, when at that point the prophets were able to essentially remote viewing with flawless accuracy because it was from God, a true transmission that was totally without space or time. So in a sense now, where people were able to, where the results of remote viewing were 100% or flawless because there was a divine transmission, a divine intervention, and if you look at it as, in a spiritual sense, as God being absolute truth, then what they speak has to be 100%.
Okay. What he's asked is maybe we should liken remote viewing to the term gnosis. used by the Gnostics and the prophets and people who believed they were receiving their information from the divine. And that is another model. I think it's one we need to pay attention to. Personally, I consider myself a secular person, not necessarily a religious person, meaning organized religion. And I think there are lots of problems with the model that once God speaks through you, then you are infallible and 100% accurate. As far as I'm concerned, I would avoid that.
Well, I'm not saying as a model, but
Yeah.
like, for example, in times past, that there were certain prophets who spoke particular truths that at that moment was accurate, but they never held to a point that everything they spoke was, I understand the point you're making, that once you have this gift, that is perpetual, and that whatever you speak is absolute truth, and I'm not holding to that.
Yeah. But in any case, you're suggesting that, maybe there's a factor that in philosophy and in theology is called the divine, and that enters into it. And I think that's worthy of consideration.
Jeff, one more question, if you would.
Okay, one last question. Yes.
Dr. Mishlove, how in your studies, in the framework of the things you discussed, how fluid or fixed do you view the future? I would think that whatever the reality that is, to me personally, I think it's more fluid than some people seem to
Yeah.
think. And it would affect what we're viewing and the overall accuracy of it. It might even tie in with this idea of gnosis and
Right.
what we're tuning in on.
The question is, how fluid do I think the future is, or do I think it's fixed? And to be honest with you, I don't know. I don't have a clue. The way I try to approach it is to think of the philosophy that the universe, that the future is fixed, that everything is preordained. That's one reality that has its own set of metaphors and language, and the idea that the future is probabilistic is another. I like Russell Targ's new book, The End of Suffering, in which he suggests that we ought to look at Buddhist logic rather than Aristotelian logic. We're accustomed to Aristotelian thinking in which either the future is fixed or it's probabilistic. Can't be both. And whereas Buddhist logic, as Russell has explained it in his book, suggests that maybe both could be true, or neither could be true. We don't have to think of anything in the world as either or. So thank you very much, and a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.